Welcome to a Healer's Guide to Algothar Academy, everyone's favorite dungeon back for Season 4. In this guide, we'll talk about every mechanic and how it pertains to the healers and how you can combat them. My name's LBNinja7 and let's get into it. Before we get started on this guide, here are a few talents that you might want to consider for certain mechanics throughout this dungeon. Starting off, don't forget to grab a buff in the starting room. I prefer to get the versatility buff from the red dragonflight recruiter because versatility helps our damage, healing, and survivability. Moving into the first boss room, up the stairs to the right is Overgrown Ancient and his trash. Now his trash is comprised of 3 different types of enemies. You have the large lashers, the small lashers, and the aggravated skitter flies. The large lashers will continuously spawn swirlies underneath every player that you just need to step out of, so don't stand where another player was just standing. The little lashers don't have any scary mechanics, the only issue is that while they're still alive, your tank will be taking a bit more damage. The aggravated skitterflies, though, can cause quite a bit of problems. They'll be jumping to random allies, casting darting sting, just doing a large slam of damage on that ally. The pool sizes in this room can get pretty large, but a lot of the upfront damage as soon as you pool is going to be on the tank before the skitterflies have agitated and while the pool count is large. So as the healer, absolutely make sure and pocket heal your tank as soon as you walk into this room, especially if it's a Blood Death Knight or a Brewmaster Monk, as they will need a bit of time to collect some resources. And then as you transition further into this pool, as the small lashers die off and the aggravated skitterflies start to agitate, that is when the party-wide damage significantly starts to amp up. So as the healer, once again, you definitely want to be pocket healing the tank on pool. You want to use as much crowd control as you can on the aggravated skitterflies. And don't hesitate to pop 1 or 2 throughput cooldowns to combat the large damage that will be coming from the aggravated skitterflies. Also, make sure and spot heal the darting sting target as soon as possible because this pool becomes very scary for the DPS if multiple darting stings target the same player in quick succession. And since the size of the pools on this platform can get pretty large, I've added in some recommended cooldowns that tend to scale based on the amount of enemies that you have to fight. Also, don't hesitate to use one of your external DRs or Life Cocoon on the tank to make sure that they can survive all of that incoming damage. Moving on to the first boss, Overgrown Ancient. Throughout this fight, this boss is going to cast Germinate, which is going to spawn a lot of swirlies underneath each player, so it's very important to have a stack point. Whether you mark the tank, mark yourself, just make sure that everyone knows where to start this movement and which direction to move. Be on the lookout though for people that don't move quick enough or don't stay with the pack, because if they are hit by one of these swirlies, they'll take pretty significant damage and risk dying. So always watch health bars and have a shock heal at the ready for these players. After the boss is done casting Germinate and the final swirlies have spawned, the swirlies will then turn into an enemy called Hungry Lasher. For the most part, these Hungry Lashers aren't that scary. However, if you do not kill them quickly, they can get out of control. So do whatever AoE damage you have in your kit as soon as these ads spawn, because shortly after the boss will follow it up with a follow-up mechanic. Now how this boss operates is he tends to alternate between 2 different mechanics that follow up these Germinates. Starting with the first Germinate, every odd cast will spawn a significant ad called the Ancient Branch. Your job as the healer is to make sure that the Ancient Branch does not get a cast off, because this Ancient Branch is trying to show you up on the meters and heal the boss back to full. Swap to this Ancient Branch immediately to help the DPS get this guy down quick. However, as soon as it dies, you will have to go into throughput mode and pop at least 1 minor cooldown because the group will take a large bit of damage. Stack on the Ancient Branch after it dies though, however, to stop this damage. On the even Germinate casts, however, the boss will attempt to cast Burst Forth. It is your #1 priority to make sure that everyone is fully topped up before this Burst Forth cast finishes, because this thing does so much damage, and it also makes all of the lashers that Germinate spawns go from being dormant to active. Your tank and possibly some DPS that grabbed aggro on these guys will be under a huge amount of pressure. Because now all of a sudden about 30 of these guys are going to be hitting your tank trying to apply a lasher Toxin. This debuff is one of a few reasons why we took our Poison Dispel into this dungeon, and it's imperative that you dispel your tank as often as possible. For the most part, this boss is pretty easy on the healers. Just keep your tank alive, have a cooldown rolling for Burst Forth on the even cast Germinates, and the boss should fall over in no time. Continuing counterclockwise from this boss room, we are moving toward Croth. But before we get there, there is a gatekeeper, Guardian Sentry. Now, for the most part, this ad is not that threatening. However, he will be spawning deadly winds all throughout the platform that you as the healer will want to pay extra attention to. If one of your DPS or your tank gets hit by this, you will have to do some serious spot healing, so always keep your eyes on these deadly winds. Every now and then, this Guardian Sentry will attempt to push everyone off this platform with Expel Intruders. Just make sure to move out of its range or, more easily, line of sight this cast. Moving on to the boss platform, we have two types of eagles to worry about. First up are the little guys, the territorial eagles. All they really do is peck your tank. So once again, keep your hots rolling on your tank and pay attention to their health, as this can overwhelm them, especially because of one of the alpha eagles mechanics. These eagles will periodically attempt to cast Call of the Flock, so just make sure you're using your AoE CC or your kicks to stop these casts, because it will make all of these enemies attack faster, melting your tank's health bar. Also, try your best to stay in melee on these packs, because the Alpha Eagles will turn to a random player and attempt to cast Gust, which is a frontal cone that does significant damage and knocks you back. So the closer you are to these guys, the easier it is to dodge this frontal. Once the Eagles are handled, the boss Croth comes down. And if you've ever seen Space Jam, you should be fine on this boss. Just like the Alpha Eagles, this boss does have a Gust or a frontal cone ability, except it's called Overpowering Gust. Once again, it does massive damage, however, it will knock you off of the platform if you're hit. So just like the Alpha Eagles, you're going to want to stand close to this boss, that way it's easier to move out of the cone. Also, this boss has an evolved form of the Territorial Eagle's Peck, which is called Savage Peck. You're going to want to pay attention to this cast because it can nuke the tanks. As always, have your hots rolling on the tank and keep them nice and healthy. Now, this boss does have a pretty significant healer mechanic called Deafening Screech. Make sure that you are not casting any spells while this cast goes off, as it will silence you for 6 seconds and interrupt your cast. I cannot stress to you guys enough how important it is to make sure that everyone is fully topped up before this cast goes off. How this works is, like I said, it'll interrupt your casts, it does a huge amount of damage, and more importantly, it'll apply a debuff to everyone in the group, increasing any further damage you take from Deafening Screech by 50%. As you can imagine, this can amp up on consecutive casts a ton. So do not take this mechanic lightly, as it can one-shot you or your group mates. Luckily though, not all hope is lost, as this is where the basketball mechanic comes in. At 75% and 45% health, the boss will spawn 2 basketball goals. The fire goal on the right side and the wind goal on the left side. The boss also spawns 3 basketballs on the map. Your party's objective is to score 3 times in the same goal to activate that goal. Now, the fire side goal is the most pug friendly, as it will just spawn swirlies for the rest of the fight. Activating one of these goals, however, has an upside and a downside. One of the upsides is that it'll reset the damage amplification of Deafening Screech that everyone in the group has. That way it doesn't just scale infinitely. If you activated the fire goal, the boss will now spawn fire swirlies throughout the rest of the fight. Just make sure and dodge these, as they will one-shot you. However, the fire goal also has another upside of turning off the boss for 12 seconds and giving your entire party a 75% damage amp for that 12 seconds. So do your best to pump your damage during this phase. If you activated the wind goal, it has the downside of having winds push you across the battlefield for the rest of the fight. It also spawns tornadoes that attempt to knock you off the platform. However, the upside is there are also a couple of orbs that spawn on the platform that if you pick them up, you will get 45% haste and 50% movement speed for 20 seconds, also making you immune to the winds. So as the healer, you really want to pay attention to how many times Deafening Screech has gone off, and also how much damage your party is taking from it. As consecutive casts go off, they will be doing more damage, but for the most part, groups should not let this cast 4 times consecutively without turning on one of the goals. Once again, your number one priority is to keep everyone topped up before this cast goes off. That way their defensive math doesn't get all wonky. I've put up some suggested ways to deal with consecutive casts on the screen that can help you keep your party and yourself alive. However, this is just a suggestion how I would go about it depending on what class you're on. But using these damage amplifications, you should be able to tackle this boss pretty easily once you get the hang of the Screech mechanic. So let's move over toward Vexus. Now this section of the dungeon has some of the most deadly enemies and casts in the entire dungeon. There are a few arcane ravagers, which are just mini boss serpents that you have to look out for. These will attempt to jump to one of your allies doing massive AoE damage, and then aim a frontal breath at your party. Do not hesitate to spot heal this target and make sure and dodge the breath, and this enemy is actually pretty easy to deal with. Depending on how your tank decides to pull these enemies can change a lot of things about this part of the dungeon. Since almost every enemy has a pretty deadly mechanic, this is where you're going to want to utilize all of your AoE CC. As the spellbound casters will be attempting to cast Mystic Blast, which does absolutely insane AoE damage to the party. This has been nerfed coming into Season 4, but still make sure that you stun, boop, paralysis, do whatever you can to stop this cast from going off. However, your interrupts should be going towards Mana Void, as this cast puts a heavy dot on one of your allies and then causes them to explode at the end of its duration. If one of these casts goes through, make it your absolute number one priority to heal them to full during the dot, that way the eruption does not kill them. If your group is on top of their kicks and CC, you can use your kick on Surge, because Surge is just a big smack of damage on one of your allies. However, I know this isn't a perfect world and some casts might actually slip through. So it's your job as the healer to make sure that if any of these casts do go off, you heal them up immediately. If 2 surges hit the same person, they are most likely dead. Same with a mana void and a surge, and same with 2 mana voids. So be ready to spot heal these casts at any cost. The tank will also be under significant pressure because the spellbound battle axes will apply a bleed to them that does significant damage. Once again, these packs are pretty execution based. However, in a lot of pug groups, it will come down to the healer to be able to heal back all the health that these casts do. So make sure and plan your cooldowns accordingly, and do not hesitate to pop a cooldown on these packs. Also, if anyone is put to sleep by monotonous lecture, make sure and dispel them, as no one likes to sit in timeout for 8 seconds. Moving on to Vexus, this boss can give healers a ton of issues. Now, for the most part, its 3 mechanics aren't that scary, but what is scary is how they can overlap with each other. Starting off with the most bare bones mechanic, Vexus will spawn arcane orbs around the room that will attempt to reach the boss. It's your job as the player to soak these orbs so that they don't hit the boss. The only issue is that if you do soak one of these orbs, it will apply a debuff on you that will make soaking further orbs do significantly more damage to yourself. So if you do intend on soaking more than 1 orb per wave, make sure and pop a defensive and dispel yourself afterwards. Otherwise, a lot of groups will opt to do this mechanic as it's intended, which is just each player soaks 1 orb. If that's the case, then make sure and use your dispel on cooldown to keep this debuff on as few people as possible. Arcane Fissure is his ultimate ability, which happens when he reaches 100 energy. If any of the arcane orbs made their way to the boss, then this will happen more often. However, how this cast works is it knocks every player back, does significant party-wide damage, and then causes all players to spawn swirls under their feet for a few seconds. Have a cooldown rolling as this cast goes off, as you will want everyone to be at full health once it happens. Then don't plant immediately after this cast goes off, as the swirls will catch you. Make sure the swirls have stopped spawning under your feet, and then top up everyone as quick as you can. The boss's 3rd and final mechanic is called Mana Bombs, where the boss will apply a debuff to 3 players in the party. This debuff is very scary, as it ticks for a lot of damage over 4 seconds. At the end of this 4-second duration, it will erupt, leaving a puddle behind that does significant damage, but also nuking the 3 targets. As the healer, do whatever it takes to keep these 3 people alive. Whether that means using an external on them, popping one of your major cooldowns, or just cranking spot healing into these 3 people, you will thank me for it later. And like I said earlier in the fight, the scariest part of this fight is when multiple mechanics overlap. So always be on the lookout if the boss is attempting to cast Arcane Fissure, as you have the mana bombs applied to 3 people, and don't be afraid to overcommit healing cooldowns if this does happen. After these 3 bosses are taken down, you finally gain access to the final tail of the dungeon. However, before you make your way to the boss, you do have some trash to clear. Luckily, this trash isn't too scary, and since this is the tail end of the dungeon, you're likely to have a lot of AoE CC as well as your kick available to use. Starting off, the Echo Knights have a spin mechanic called Astral Whirlwind that does insane damage if you happen to get hit by it. Do your best to move out of this mechanic or just stun these guys or CC them, as that will stop the spin. Next up is the Spectral Invoker that has 2 casts that are both worth kicking. Arcane Missiles will just channel into one of your allies, which you should spot heal through or decide to kick this or stop this cast. It also has an Astral Bomb cast that puts a bomb on one of your allies, and then after 3 seconds it'll do significant damage to them and anyone around them. If one of these casts goes off, make sure that this player is fully topped up before this explosion happens and just move out of its radius. As long as you follow these 3 mechanics with spot healing, these enemies should not pose any threat. Also worth noting, your tank is likely to pull a bunch of these mobs all together. If this is the case, don't be afraid to use one of your healing cooldowns just in case one of these casts gets through. Moving on to the final boss, Echo of Dagosa. This boss is an entirely new beast coming into Season 4. But with a proper understanding of this fight and its new mechanics, you can shrug off this boss as easily as the others. You'll start this fight with 2 arcane rifts positioned like so on the ground. These arcane rifts should be dodged at all costs because standing in them will cause significant damage. These rifts also shoot out bullets called uncontrolled energy throughout the fight. Now, these are not the only 2 arcane rifts that you'll see, as you will quickly notice the entire room starts to get filled up. Because how this boss works is every mechanic this boss does, every instance of damage that you take, will give that player a 5% damage amp. Pretty cool, right? Well, it's pretty risky because once a player takes their 3rd stack of this damage amp, they actually lose all the buffs and spawn another one of these arcane rifts. It's very important as the healer to understand how many stacks each player has of overwhelming power, as that will come up later. Aside from the bullet hell spawning from these arcane rifts, what are the mechanics that this boss has? Well, once this boss reaches 100 energy, it'll attempt to cast a giant frontal that absolutely needs to be dodged, called Astral Breath, as this is very likely to one-shot you. This boss will also periodically cast an enhanced version of arcane missiles at one of your party members. It's imperative to spot heal to counteract this damage. The boss will also cast Power Vacuum, sucking everyone in and then attempting to one-shot them. Make sure to run out as soon as you can after getting sucked in, and this is the mechanic that you want to combat with one of your healing cooldowns to make sure that everyone is healthy as they run out. And finally, the boss will periodically apply a dispellable debuff called Energy Bomb to one of your allies. Make sure that this ally is not next to one of your other allies or yourself before you dispel them, because it will nuke anyone in its radius. Also, make sure that this player is topped up before you attempt to dispel them or before its 6-second duration ends. That way they don't succumb to this debuff. And finally, make sure that they are in a good spot to drop an Arcane Rift, just in case dispelling them will cause them to do so. As once again, reaching 3 stacks of overwhelming power will cause an Arcane Rift to spawn. Make sure that Energy Bomb is dispelled before the boss pulls everyone in with Power Vacuum, or you will get womboed. This fight very quickly becomes a bullet hell version of Dodgeball, but committing your cooldowns to healing everyone after a Power Vacuum happens, or before the Power Vacuum happens to keep everyone healthy coming into it, as well as spot healing the Energy Bomb and Arcane Missiles targets, will be your ticket to success in this fight. I can't stress to you enough though how important it is to make sure that your ally is in a good spot before dispelling them. But guys, that's going to do it for this Healer's Guide to Algothar Academy. My goal with this series is to give you, the healer, every tool that you need to tackle this dungeon without giving you any unnecessary knowledge. If you like this series and want to see more dungeon guides like this for Season 4 and moving forward, make sure and hit the like button and hit subscribe so you don't miss when those go live. As you can imagine, this took so long to make, but I really wanted to make it, and I think that it should help a lot of players. I quickly want to shout out the patrons of this channel, as they are the reason why videos like this can exist, why I can be a YouTuber and attempt to live my lifelong dream. So thank you so much if your name is on the screen. And if you want to join these guys, check out that link down in the description. There are a ton of different tiers that you can choose to support. Once again, thank you for watching this video. Go tackle this dungeon. It's really not that bad. And if you have any questions or want me to explain anything further, make sure and hit me up down in the comments below. I'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, take care.